when the cost of pausing feels higher than the cost of pushing, endurance stops being a choice and becomes a survival strategy. This doesn't make you weak, it makes you human inside a system that hasn't actually learned how to protect the people who hold it up. Functioning is not the same as being well, though, and coping is not the same as capacity. And here's the deeper truth: when leaders override their limits, they unintentionally teach their teams to override theirs. This is where the intergenerational thread begins. There's a moment every leader recognizes, a quiet, private moment where the pressure rises and you tell yourself, I need to push a little harder. It sounds responsible, it sounds committed, it sounds like leadership. But endurance feels like strength until up to the very moment it becomes self-extraction. Most leaders don't notice the shift, they only notice the cost. Welcome back to the Leadership Longevity Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Hughes, and today we're beginning with a myth that sits at the heart of modern leadership, the myth of endurance. This is a belief that if you just push a little harder, you'll get through it, that effort is the answer, and that stamina is the strategy. But endurance has a cost, one most leaders don't see until they're already paying for it. So inside the leadership longevity ecosystem, this myth sits within our first survival driver. Number one, the health depletion pattern. This driver fractures your internal layer, your adaptive systems, the part of the ecosystem that holds the biology, the psychology, your energy, your cognitive load, your emotional bandwidth, and your recovery cycles. At the center of that internal layer sits your operating system. And this operating system has 4 events: endurance, recovery, adaptation, and rhythm. And these 4 events stable your internal rhythm under load. So endurance is key, but without the other 3 events, it teaches you to treat your body as optional. But in regenerative leadership, health is infrastructure. And when leaders forget that, the cost doesn't just show up in capacity, it shows up in their relationships, their clarity, their decision making, and the way they shape the world around them. Because leadership is never just about you, it's about the people who come after you, the ones inheriting the systems you're shaping today. And that's the quiet intergenerational truth woven throughout this work. So the myth of endurance says, if I push harder, I'll get through this. It tells you your effort is infinite, that your body will keep up, that your mind will cooperate, and that your nervous system will tolerate whatever you demand of it. Fortunately, though, biology has a different opinion. Endurance without rhythm isn't resilience, it's depletion. And depletion is not a leadership strategy, it's a slow unraveling. So here's the lived experience then. You're tired, but you keep going. You're stretched, but you keep saying yes. Often because somewhere along the way you learned that your worth is tied to your capacity. You're overwhelmed, but you tell yourself it's temporary. You push through the fog, you override the systems, often because you've been taught that strength means self-silencing. You ignore the whispers of fatigue, which are not just sensations, but your brain's predictions about your body budget running low. And because you can still function, you assume you're fine. Sometimes you push yourself because you choose to. Sometimes you push yourself because the system around you leaves you no real alternative. A deadline, a crisis. A leader who equates urgency with commitment. A culture where slowing down is interpreted as a lack of dedication. And for some leaders, this pressure isn't subtle, it's explicit. Get it done, or there are consequences. So when the cost of pausing feels higher than the cost of pushing, endurance stops being a choice and becomes a survival strategy. This doesn't make you weak, it makes you human inside a system that hasn't actually learned how to protect the people who hold it up. Functioning is not the same as being well, though, and coping is not the same as capacity. And here's the deeper truth: when leaders override their limits, they unintentionally teach their teams to override theirs. This is where the intergenerational thread begins, in the behaviours we model and the systems we normalize. So, endurance is seductive because it feels noble. It feels like commitment. It feels like resilience. It feels like responsibility. People admire your stamina. They praise your work ethic. They rely on your consistency. And sometimes you're not pushing to survive. Sometimes you're pushing because you're actually energized by the work. So don't forget that either. You might be lit up by the fact that by the fact you're building something that's really important to you. You might feel alive inside the challenge. But even flow states require a peak to baseline cycle. So without the baseline, the peak collapses. Inspiration can mask this depletion, though, and that's why endurance is just so tricky, because sometimes it feels really good right up until the moment it doesn't. Not because stress is harmful, but because stress without recovery becomes unsustainable. Endurance feels like the path to excellence until it quietly becomes the thing that erodes it. And when leaders erode, cultures erode with them. This is how depletion becomes inherited, not genetically, but culturally. So then let's tell a story about, say, Daniel. So this leader I've supported over a number of years embodied this myth perfectly. Daniel was brilliant, sharp, compassionate, committed, the kind of leader that would carry a team through chaos. But he had one pattern. Whenever things got hard, he pushed harder. He worked late, he skipped breaks, he powered through fatigue. He treated exhaustion like a scheduling issue. And then finally, after a particularly intense quarter, he took a holiday. 10 days away, no laptop, no meetings, no demands. And for a moment, it worked. He slept, he laughed, he felt like he moved his old self again. But within 48 hours of coming back to work, the exhaustion returned. I'm sure many of you will find this very familiar, not as a dramatic crash, but as a familiar heaviness. And that's when he said something I've heard from so many leaders. I'm doing everything I've always done, but it's not working anymore. That's the moment that you know that someone has crossed the invisible line, the line where an endurance stops being a strength and starts becoming a liability. Relief isn't the same as recovery. So relief changes your environment, whereas recovery changes your physiology. And here's the part that Daniel didn't see yet. His team had been mirroring him for years. They'd learned his rhythm, or lack of one, and they'd inherited his pace, his urgency, his silencing. This is how endurance becomes intergenerational, passed down through culture, not DNA. So let's ground this discussion then in physiology. So allostatic load, the wear and tear your body accumulates when it stays in a state of heightened or in a heightened state for too long. It's not dramatic, it's not sudden, it's slow erosion. Your memory gets patchy, your patience shortens, your creativity narrows, your sleep becomes shallow. Biology is actually trying to get your attention. So then we think about recovery. So most leaders assume that recovery must be big, a holiday, a long weekend, a break you earn. And sometimes it just feels good to think that way anyway. But your body doesn't recover in dramatic bursts, it recovers in tiny, frequent moments, seconds and minutes, not days. Skipping micro recovery doesn't just skip rest, it skips the physiological reset that keeps your performance sharp. And when you push past your limits, your brain shifts into a narrower, more reactive mode. Working memory declines, creativity drops, decision making can become quite rigid. So, this is a sign that your prefrontal cortex is going offline. And then, of course, we have elite athletes who don't extend performance by pushing harder, they extend by recovering better. They protect sleep, they schedule micro recovery, they treat rest as part of training. And yeah, they do train hard, but they also rest and have micro recovery because they know something that most leaders forget. Performance isn't just extended by effort, it's extended by rhythm. And this rhythm is what allows leadership to become sustainable across generations, not just within a single career. So then, endurance without recovery isn't resilience, it's depletion. It's the moment when strength becomes strain and where commitment becomes erosion, where you're no longer drawing from capacity, but extracting from yourself just to keep going. Load doesn't just sit in your muscles, though, it sits in your physical system, your mental system, your emotional system, your social system, and sometimes your financial system. And these are the five factors, your capacity reservoirs. And when one reservoir drains, the others compensate until the whole system becomes unstable. That's why recovery isn't for the exhausted, it's for the ambitious, because ambitious leaders shape the conditions that others inherit. Recovery, then, is not the opposite of performance, it's the source of it. Your clarity depends on it, your steadiness depends on it, your decision making depends on it, and your leadership present depends on it. Nothing is wrong with you, your system simply needs rhythm, not more effort. When leaders override recovery, they don't just lose energy, they lose their adaptability, they lose clarity, they lose themselves. And that's why the myth of endurance is the first myth, because it fractures the entire ecosystem. And when ecosystems fracture, they don't just affect the present, they shape the present. So before we go any further, I want to introduce three tools you'll hear throughout the series. They're simple, they're small, and they're intentionally designed to work together. So the first one is a tiny experiment. So a tiny experiment is not a goal, it's a micro interruption, a small time-bound action that helps you learn something about yourself in real time. Tiny experiments bypass pressure and tap into curiosity. They interrupt automatic patterns and they loosen old scripts. The second tool is reflective questions, and they create a moment of awareness, a pause before habit takes over. They strengthen introspection and your ability to read your internal cues, which is foundational for sustainable leadership. And then the third practice is the ecosystem practice, which is a small, repeatable ritual that strengthens your leadership capacity over time, where a tiny experiment helps you notice something new. An ecosystem practice is a small, repeatable ritual that strengthens your leadership capacity over time, where a tiny experiment helps you notice something new, and ecosystem practice helps you build something new. So, how they work together then is that the tiny experiment interrupts the whole pattern, the reflective question helps you understand the pattern, and the ecosystem practice gives you a new pattern to build, interrupt, understand, integrate. This is the behavioral arc of the ecosystem. So, for our first myth, our tiny experiment is to take one micro pause today, 60 seconds, one slow breath with a longer inhale, or perhaps a gentle stretch, a moment of stillness with your feet on the floor. The only job is to notice what shifts when you stop for 1 minute. Our reflective question is, what is my body telling me right now that my mind is trying to override? And I can meet that truth with kindness rather than judgment. And finally, the practice for this week. Choose the moment when you're most often or most likely to override your body's request to pause and anchor a micro recovery ritual into 1 hour of your day. Predictable, repeatable, yours. This is how you extend your capacity. This is how you sustain high value. This is how you lead without eroding yourself. And this is how you model a rhythm of leadership that others can inherit. Your capacity is built in the pauses. So releasing the myth of endurance feels like stepping out of strain and coming back to yourself. It's like your mind clearing, your body settling, your decisions coming from grounded confidence instead of the pressure or momentum. It feels spacious, humane, sustainable, like you're finally building a long game you can actually live inside. Leadership is no different. There's a moment when you realize that the thing carrying you isn't your endurance. It's your rhythm. It's your system learning you and you learning the system. You don't need a week off, as nice as it is. You need moments that bring you back into your body, back into your breath, and back into the ecosystem that's trying to support you. Endurance without recovery is depletion with better branding. Recovery isn't a luxury, it's a leadership infrastructure. And this is where longevity begins. Not in the push, but in the rhythm that sustains you. And when you lead from rhythm, you don't just change your own trajectory, you change the trajectory of the people who follow you. In our next episode, we're exploring the myth of deferral, the belief that your health can wait and you can get to yourself later. If endurance is the myth of pushing, deferral is a myth of postponing. It quietly shapes the way leaders trade today for tomorrow. I'll meet you there.